Good afternoon. Previous session we learned about the conditions of the woman during French Revolution, and also we learned about the role of the woman, and also we came to know that one of the revolutionary lady Olympia de Gauzies, what she was drawn the Declaration of Rights of Women and Citizens, and whatever she was expressed through that, all those things, so we learned in the previous class. Today's class we are going to learn about the abolition of slavery in France country. The abolition of slavery, the slave system, how it was actually came to an end in the France country. So let us discuss about little bit. See here, one of the most revolutionary social reform, especially from the Jacobin clubs or the Jacobin regime, that is about the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. So when the revolutionary club, especially the Jacobin regime, came to power, of course, in a short time. So it was taken one of the social reform, one of the best step about the abolition of the slave system in the France country. Of course, dear students, so it was one of the most revolutionary social reform of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slave system or slavery in the France country. So here the colonies in Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo. So these were the different colonies: Caribbean, Martinique and Guadeloupe and San Domingo. See, these were important suppliers of commodities of such as tobacco, coffee, indigo, sugar, and so on and so forth. So these colonies are actually, so they were important suppliers of these commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. So which are those colonies? Caribbean and Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo. So these colonies were so most important suppliers of these commodities. So actually, the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor, especially on the plantations. So the most of these crops are plantations crops, especially the indigo, even the tobacco also, sugar and coffee. So here the Europeans, so they were reluctance of, why they were reluctant? Because due to different reasons. So they were not interested to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands. They were not ready to go and work in unfamiliar lands. That meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. ಸೊ ಅದ್ರ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಯಾವಾಗ ಯುರೋಪಿಯನ್ಸ್ಗಳು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ದೂರದ ಅಪರಿಚಿತ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಅವ್ರು ಹಿಂಜರಿತಾರೋ, ಅವಾಗ ಯೂಶುವಲಿ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟೇಶನ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಕೊರತೆ ಎದುರಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ದ ಶಾರ್ಟೇಜ್ ಆಫ್ ಲೇಬರ್ಸ್. Then afterwards what happened? Of course, it was very much essential the more number of laborers and plantations. So plantations ಅಲ್ಲಿ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಗಳು ಬಹಳ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್, ಲೇಬರ್ಸ್ ಬಹಳ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ actually to meet this, They were taught to trade. What trade? That's called as a slave trade. So illinda shuru agutte makla slave trade especially. So actually what happened now, to meet the shortage of laborers on the plantations, understood now. So to this was met by a triangular slave trade. Then ಏನಂತ ಕರೀತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ triangular slave trade between three countries. So that's what used to call as a triangular slave trade. So between three, especially Europe, Africa and Americas. ಸೊ ಈ ಮೂರು ಭೂಭಾಗದ ಜೊತೆ ಏನಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಸೊ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ದ trade start between these three especially continents, Europe, Africa and Americas. And this was actually well known as a triangular slave trade in the history. ಇತಿಹಾಸದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಸೊ ಟ್ರಯಾಂಗ್ಯುಲರ್ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಕರೀತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ದ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಬಿಗ್ಯಾನ್ when it was began, so specially the slave trade in European countries, it was began in 17th century. 17ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ during 17th century the slave trade was began in European countries. So how they were actually, this is what used to called as a triangular slave trade of Europe, Africa and America. How, from where they are bringing? See, French merchants actually sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nice to the American coast. So ಆ ಬಂದರು ನಗರಗಳಾದಂತಹ ಬೋರ್ಡೋ ಮತ್ತೆ ನಾಯ್ಸ್ ಇಂದ ಅಮೆರಿಕದ ಕೋಸ್ಟ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಫ್ರೆಂಚ್ ಮರ್ಚೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಸೇಲ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ವೇರ್ ದೇ ಬಾಟ್ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಲೋಕಲ್ chieftains. ಸೊ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ದೇ ವರ್ ಬ್ರಾಟ್ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಲೋಕಲ್ chieftains. ಅವ್ರ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಹೇಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಸೊ ಅವರು ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂದು ಈ ಒಂದು ಆಫ್ರಿಕನ್ ಕೋಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಆಫ್ರಿಕಾದ ಕರಾವಳಿ ಪ್ರದೇಶಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿನ ಲೋಕಲ್ chieftains, ಅಲ್ಲಿನ ಲೋಕಲ್ ಹೆಡ್ಸ್ಗಳು ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂದಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಹೆಂಗಂದ್ರೆ ಲೈಕ್ ದ ಗೂಡ್ಸ್. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಒನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಇಲ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಆರ್ ಇಲ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟಿಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಸೊಸೈಟೀಸ್. ಸೊ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ದೇ ವರ್ ಬ್ರ್ಯಾಂಡೆಡ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಶಾಕಲ್ಡ್. ಹೆಂಗಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ಕೈಗಳಿಗೆ ಲಾಕ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ವಾಟ್ ವಿ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಕೋಳ ಅಥವಾ ಬೆಡಿ ಹಾಕ್ದಂಗೆ. ಸೊ ದ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಸ್ ದೇ ವರ್ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ shackled. The slaves were packed tightly into ships. How they were packing? No sufficient air, nothing. So hange luggage na pack ಮಾಡಿ ಹಾಕ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ ಮಕ್ಕಳ, ಸೊ ಹಂಗೆ ಟೈಟ್ ಪ್ಯಾಕ್. ದಟ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಬಿಟ್ಟೆ ಜನ ಕುರಿನಾದ್ರೂ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಮಕ್ಕಳ, ತುಂಬಿ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಶಿಪ್ಸ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಟು ರೀಚ್ ಅಟ್ಲಾಂಟಿಕ್ ಟು ದ ಕೆರಿಬಿಯನ್. It was actually a long voyage. The 3 months ಎಷ್ಟು ತಗೊಳ್ತಿತ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳ, ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕೆರೇಬಿಯನ್ ತೀರ ಪ್ರದೇಶವನ್ನು ಸೇರ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಸೊ 3 ತಿಂಗಳುಗಳ ಕಾಲ, 3 months continuous voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean Sea. It was taken almost all 3-month long voyage. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಹ್ಯಾಂಗ್ ತಂದು ಲಗೇಜ್ ತರ ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಅಂಡ್ ಕೆರೇಬಿಯನ್ ತಲುಪಿದ ಮೇಲೆ ದೇರ್ ದೇ ವರ್ ಸೋಲ್ಡ್ ಟು ಪ್ಲಾಂಟೇಶನ್ ಓನರ್ಸ್. ದ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಸ್ those who are brought from the African coast, so now in the Caribbean area, so they were sold to plantation owners. See, the exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets, especially for sugar, coffee and indigo. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಲೇಬರ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ತಗೊಂಡು ಬಂದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಹಚ್ಚಿ, ಸೊ ನಾವು they were able to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕೆಲಸದಾಳುಗಳ ತಂದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹಚ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅವರು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. See, port cities like Bordeaux and even Nantes vowed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೋರ್ಡಿಯಾಕ್ಸ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ನಾಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಸೊ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ನ ಪ್ರಮುಖ ಕೇಂದ್ರಗಳಾಗಿ ಅವು ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಯನ್ನು ಅಥವಾ ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧಿಯನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿತು. Especially the Bordeaux and the Nantes vowed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. By developing the slave trade, they were become popular. See, it was began in the 17th century, and throughout the 18th century there was a little criticism of slavery in France. Up to 18th century ತನಕ little bit ಯಾರೋ ಕ್ರಿಟಿಸೈಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ slaves. Especially the National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including especially those in the colonies. But it did not pass any law. The National Assembly, even after the debate also, it did not pass any laws because fearing opposition from businessmen, because whose incomes depended on the slave trade. ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಮ್ಯಾನ್ಗಳ ಇನ್ಕಮ್ ವಸ್ತು ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಡಿಪೆಂಡ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಅದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸೊ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಅಸೆಂಬ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ಕಾನೂನನ್ನ ಜಾರಿ ಮಾಡುವಂತ ಧೈರ್ಯವನ್ನ ಮಾಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಸೊ ದ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಅಸೆಂಬ್ಲಿ ಫೀಲ್ಸ್ ಫಿಯರಿಂಗ್ ಆಪೋಸಿಷನ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ದೋಸ್ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ಪ್ರಾಫಿಟ್ ಡಿಪೆಂಡೆಡ್ ಆನ್ ದ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions in 1774. Anyhow, dear students, this however turned out to be a short-term measure. So even so ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಸ್ಲೇವ್ಗಳನ್ನ ಬಿಡುಗಡೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಫ್ರೀ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತ 1794 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಲೆಜಿಸ್ಲೇಟಿವ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪಾಸ್ ಆದ್ರೂ ಸಹ ಇದು ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಫಾರ್ ಶಾರ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್. Because after 10 years, when Napoleon Bonaparte himself he was declared as the king of France, so again Napoleon Bonaparte was reintroduced slave systems. This is what unfortunately happened in the France history. So Napoleon Bonaparte even he brought a lot of changes in his administration. He was declared himself as the modernizer of Europe, even by the historians also. Even though Napoleon was reintroduced slave systems, especially the plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their incomes, especially economic interests. They were believed that, they were understood that the plantation owners, actually the Negroes disturbed used for the indigenous people of Africa, especially south of the Sahara African countries. So actually it is a derogatory term not in common use any longer. Negro pada, so at present so we should not use. Okay, so a Negro ಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ plantation owners ಗಳ ಒಂದು ಹಿಡಿತ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. Because so our economic interest in ittala, so that is completely depend upon this slave trade. So anyhow student, the slave system it was abolished in the France colonies in 1848 finally. So ಕೊನೆಗೂ ಸಹ ಈ ಒಂದು ಹೋರಾಟದಲ್ಲಿ 1848 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊನೆಗೂ ಸಹ ಈ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಲೇವ್ ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಅದನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದು ಹಾಕ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ the slavery was finally abolished. ನಿರ್ಮೂಲನೆ ಯಾವಾಗ ಗೊಳಿಸ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ especially in the French colonies. So it was abolished in French colonies, the practice of slave system and slave trade. So it was came to an end in 1848. I hope dear students you may understood this topic. Now let us discuss about the revolution and everyday life. The revolution and everyday life. Revolution and everyday life. See, just you can try to imagine, can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? These things, whether these things can we expect it is going to be changed by the politics, even the present? No. See, the years of following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. So, one of the important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was that is about the abolition of censorship. The abolition of censorship. See, in the old regime, all written materials and cultural activities, including books, newspaper, plays, could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Without observation of the king, without censors of the king, so there were no free. Even so, it was including the publication, I mean the publication of the newspaper or any kind of books or plays or even some of the other written materials, including the cultural activities. So everything that goes under the supervision of the king, after the censor only, they can, otherwise they could not. See, now the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. So, according to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, that proclaimed freedom of speech and as well as expression of these two, freedom of speech and expression, to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, printed cultures after that, so flooded the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside after that. So they all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also means that opposing views of its position through the medium of print. Because during the time, the print culture also developed in France country. The plays, songs, festive processions attracted a large number of people. This was one way they could grasp an identity with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in text which only a handful of educated people could read. I hope, dear students, so you understood about this. So, according to that, after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 79, so in 1789, so this is one of the especially abolition of censorship. So the next we are going to discuss about, actually we covered up to the end of the how the Louis administration came to an end in France country. Especially we are focused on French Revolution, which was taken place in 1789. Then afterwards, we came to know that there are so many developments taken place in a France country, that is about the constitutional monarchy and the revolutionary government and Jacobin government. And after that, again, so the France goes under the control of the Napoleon Bonaparte, who was declared himself as a emperor of the France in 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte. See, in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned himself as a emperor of the France country, and he set out to conquer neighboring European countries. The first preference was given to conquer the neighboring countries and dispossessing the dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Was actually completely disposed, and he was appointed in those places members of his own family. And even Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe because he was introduced through the 1804 Civil Code, which was called as the Napoleonic Code, which we are going to learn in the next year in the 10th standard. Okay, so through that Napoleonic Code, he was introduced so many things such as protection of private property and even uniform systems of weight and measures, which are provided by the decimal systems. And initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But of course, he brought a lot of changes in his administrative system. So that was so the historians used to call as the modernizer of Europe. But even though, dear students, very soon the Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. And he was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. So many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of the Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left those things. See, the idea of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. Please keep it in your mind. So, the most important legacy of the French Revolution that is about the ideals of the liberty and democratic rights. And these were spread from France to the rest of the Europe during the 19th century, where the feudal systems were practiced. So the French contributed these the new ideas to the entire, not only for the Europe, to the entire world, the democratic ideas and the republic concepts and all. See, colonized peoples reworked the idea of freedom for bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Even from our country also, Tipu Sultan and Rajaram Mohan Roy are, they were two best examples, individuals who responded to the ideas coming from the revolutionary France also. In this way, dear students, so the France contributed a lot through, especially that we can clearly observe during the French Revolution. Now this chapter is over. If you have any doubts, so you can call and clear your doubt. So whatever it may be. So if you are not getting or if you are not understanding, if you are confused about this chapter, okay. Thank you. Have a nice day.